that keeps coming to me, and it's one that I first came across in Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing, is context collapse. And the way human communication is designed for in-person communication, right? Even before we had the technology of writing, we would talk to the people in front of us, and we could read their body language, and they could read our body language, and there was a very specific context. And then as writing takes over, and there's more distance between the parties that are communicating with each other, but there's still some sort of bounded context. This is something that's being said in a newspaper. This is something that's being said in a theatre. This is being said in a personal letter to one person. This is being proclaimed at Speaker's Corner through a megaphone. And all those forms of communication are subtly different, and they have different purposes, and they intend to have different effects on us. And the internet just comes and slams a giant, I got an image of just a massive breeze block on all of that social infrastructure, and context collapses. And so the ability of a priest or a pastor to say something careful and biblical and pastoral to a small group of people is very different from what you're doing, Paul, which is mass communication. Although I think actually what's lovely about the little corner is it feels like a kind of attempt to almost recreate a familial feeling context in these disembodied forms of communication, which maybe gives me more hope that we're like, okay, no, we can't live with this context collapse. We cannot live with just unmediated information, some of which is profound theological truth, and some of which is absolute nonsense, being pumped at us all day, every day through the same device. We have to learn again how to discern context. And I'm really feeling the way that chaos has some really effects that I find very interesting and life-giving. It has allowed parts of what I think are profound theological truths spin out of their previous context, their container in the church, and end up, in different feeds, in different spaces, like seeds scattered to the wind. And that, I think, is part of what's drawing some unexpected people and some of this spiritual openness. But it's also meant that the structures and the social infrastructures and the communities by which we used to discern what is true and false, what is life-giving and what is unlife-giving, what is humanizing and what is unhumanizing, in my language, what's going to make us more like Jesus and what isn't, have gone. And because I increasingly agree with John Vervaeke that meaning is a communal concept that actually cannot have meaning, I think you probably can't even have truth, in your own head, which is why I hate Descartes. That is a problem for our ability to be. Jonathan Rauch, who's an atheist, but I think has some very interesting things to say about the church and where it sits now, would say to remain a reality-based community. I think, the ground of reality is God. But to remain a reality-based community, we have to keep having these structures that hold us together in collective discernment. And that's what I think is the challenge of this moment.
Yeah, and context collapse, and also a lack of shared and mutually reciprocally known context.
Yeah.
Back when, radio and television were first coming online, there was only a few stations, there was only a few channels. And in many ways, it increased the shared context for people over a larger geographical distance. Whereas previously your shared context would have been more your neighborhood and things that you could know around you. Suddenly now you can have a giant radio station broadcasting the same audio over a giant geographic area, and that brings people into greater sort of shared context in some ways, while also killing a lot of the local particularities along the way. But now, what started as a sort of a unifying force, for better and for worse, has become an individuating force. I feel like, just because there's so many different things. And then the other weird thing is that previously there was no way to really, like if you're listening to the radio or the television, because people lived more densely and because those devices were precious, you often were sharing them with other people, and you could know all these other people listen to the same thing that I did. And if I talk about this at school or at work or whatever it is, there's a decent assumption that I can make that you heard what I heard. And even if you didn't happen to listen to that channel, it won't seem weird if I bring it up.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. But nowadays it's like, and I feel like this is particularly challenging and weird in churches, because I feel like previously, maybe this is still a little bit naive, but in church, most people were spiritually formed and theologically informed by their church and by their church community. And nowadays, a pastor might have, like all of these competing influences that they don't even see what they are, dragging their congregants' attention and spiritual formation and theological ideas in a whole bunch of different directions. And a lot of people can be kind of private about those sorts of things. And so that it becomes, what exactly is the church? And are you more formed by your favorite theological, YouTube channel? Are you more formed by your church? How do you deal with, anyway, all of that complexity? Paul, you look like you have something to say.
Well, I think I really love what you said, Elizabeth, and you, Sam, too, because this context collapse and a lack of a shared story, or at least even a shared experience, I suspect that increases what we're seeing, that reactivity itself then becomes the communal experience.
Wow. Yeah.
Because, I often think about the fact that if you, again, let's think about perhaps you have the collapse of Roman civilization, you have medievalism. Great many people sort of live in what we would call a natural environment where, let's say, the rhythms of nature, the changing of the seasons, the planting and sowing, animal life, all of this sort of becomes a basic phenomenological substrata by which, and then you have, say, the mythic church in the center of the village with the steeple. And so it's very much you can have a nice little monoculture. You have all these monocultures side by side. Of course, you have these great stirring experiences like the Crusades, where suddenly you have massive exchanges, but so much of the population is living in their own little monoculture. And obviously part of what the internet, especially with the collapse of, let's say, the second world, which was the communist world, and globalism from the late 80s into the 90s, and then cable television, the internet, all of what we see again is sort of a rise in reactivity, because all of us can't help but live in our own little monocultures of one, or maybe our family, or maybe our church, or our village, or community, or what have you. But now all of the other monocultures and some much more dominant cultures sort of thrown at us. And at some point, we're going to see something that makes us react. And so then, instead of having sort of these coalitions around belief or practice or shared experience or shared narratives, we now have these massive communities of reaction. Where, it wasn't a surprise to me when I saw sort of the rise of the woke. I thought, if you don't like the woke, wait for the anti-woke, because the anti-woke, that's going to be massive. Because if you're sort of building your monoculture on gender or race or orientation or something like that, fringes have fringes, and the summation of all of those fringes will inevitably be far larger than your little monoculture.
Yeah.
And so, but the difficulty with that, of course, is this reactivity is parasitic. It relies upon a hegemon to push back against. And what we've seen in sort of the weirdness of the last few decades has been, people have noted that, for example, in the United States, dominated by, let's say, the boomers, and they're all reacting to the man. The difficulty is that the boomers are reacting, all sort of passed away in the 70s and 80s, and they're not around anymore. So then you get this conservative reaction to them that says, no, we're reacting against the hippies and the boomers. And
you get Francis Collins is still singing protest songs on the Capitol Mall after he's been removed from his position. Still out there being Woody Guthrie fighting the man with his 6-string guitar. Yeah.